Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that can be pretty uncomfortable, but is absolutely crucial to understand: the psychology behind prejudice, discrimination, and the human mind. Look, we've all been unfairly judged at some point, right? And if we're being totally honest with ourselves, we've probably done our fair share of uninformed judging too. It's just human nature. But why exactly do our brains do this? We're going to unpack what science actually tells us about why prejudice forms, how history and systems shape these mental shortcuts, and, most importantly, how the latest research proves we can actively reduce it. Let's start by looking back at the tragic story of Amadou Diallo from 1999. It's a truly devastating example of the fatal consequences that non-conscious, implicit biases can trigger in literally a split second. Diallo was just a 23-year-old immigrant, standing on the stoop of his own apartment building in the Bronx. But 4 police officers thought he looked suspicious. When he stepped back into the doorway and reached into his pocket for his ID, the officers made a fatal prejudgment. They fired 41 bullets. Now, social psychologists often point to Diallo's case as a profound, albeit heartbreaking example of that gray area between deliberate violence and an accident driven by automatic implicit biases. The prejudice here was driven by something much more subtle and honestly more insidious than simple overt hatred.
So let's get right into Section 1, the reality of prejudice.
To really understand how these split-second tragedies happen, without just labeling everyone as a conscious villain, we first need to clarify how the mind works. It's super important to define our terms here because stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination are closely connected, but they are definitely not the same thing. Think of stereotyping as a mental shortcut, an overgeneralized belief. It's actually not inherently evil. For instance, holding the stereotype that all crows have wings is pretty accurate and helps your brain process things quickly. Prejudice, on the other hand, is how you feel about that shortcut. It's an unjustified, usually negative attitude toward a whole group. But that final step, discrimination, that is when you actually act on those feelings. So let's say you hold a stereotype that overweight people are lazy. You might feel a prejudiced distaste based on that belief. But if you actually refuse to hire them for a job because of it, well, now you've crossed over into discrimination.
Moving on to Section 2, inside the biased mind. So how exactly do these normal cognitive shortcuts turn into a toxic us versus them mentality? Well, psychology tells us we naturally divide the world into groups to boost our own self-esteem. It's a concept called social identity theory. Basically, we're all looking for that communal solidarity and safety in numbers. But here's the crazy part. This desire can lead us to deride others over completely arbitrary things. Take this classic psychology experiment, for example. Researchers divided a classroom into 2 totally random groups: kids wearing sneakers and kids not wearing sneakers. Almost immediately, the sneaker-wearing kids started claiming they were the smarter group, while the kids without sneakers called the others trashy. It's wild. Each group artificially inflated its own status and aggressively put down the out-group, even though the original division meant absolutely nothing. Now, because these mental categorizations happen so incredibly fast, we often unwittingly hide our biases even from ourselves. And that is exactly why scientists use something called the Implicit Association Test, or IAT, to measure reaction times and uncover those hidden automatic prejudices. Imagine you're taking a timed test. You're asked to pair young faces with pleasant objects and old faces with unpleasant objects. Pretty straightforward, right? But then the rules switch. By measuring exactly how much your reaction time slows down during those counter-stereotypic conditions, researchers can see just how deeply wired your implicit associations really are. And yes, this happens even if you explicitly believe yourself to be completely unprejudiced.
And we can see exactly how these hidden biases translate into real-world discrimination. Take a look at this 2012 Yale study. They asked science faculty to evaluate a fictional student applicant for a lab manager job. The applications were completely identical, but there was one catch. Half the resumes said the applicant's name was John, and the other half said Jennifer. So what happened? Jennifer was viewed as significantly less competent, less likely to be hired, offered a lower starting salary, and was even deemed less likely to be mentored. But here is the real kicker. Both male and female faculty heavily penalized Jennifer. It just goes to show that people on both sides of a stereotype often harbor the exact same implicit attitudes.
Let's move to Section 3, the origins of racism.
Now, you might be wondering if our brains are naturally wired to categorize people. Does that mean racism is just some ancient, hardwired biological destiny? Is it just human nature? Well, there's a very common evolutionary myth out there that claims racism is an ancient survival tactic, something our ancestors used to hoard resources and defend their territory. But anthropological reality tells a vastly different story. Anthropologists studying contemporary hunter-gatherers, who essentially represent our ancient human past, found that early groups actually shared incredibly open communication networks. They had fluid group memberships and practically zero territorial warfare. They simply didn't view neighboring tribes as competitors that needed to be subjugated. So the evidence really does not support the idea that racism is an innate, ancient biological trait. So, if it's not genetics, what is it? Well, psychology reveals that racism is very often a defense mechanism. There's this fascinating concept called terror management theory. It suggests that when people are reminded of their own mortality, or when they're grappling with a deep sense of insecurity and insecurity, they tend to cling tightly to their in-groups. It's really a symptom of psychological ill health. To protect themselves against these heavy feelings of inadequacy, people become way more prone to prejudice, status-seeking, and even aggression. They essentially use their group identity as a desperate way to enhance their own sense of value. What this all means is that the idea of seeing race as a fixed biological hierarchy is actually a relatively modern invention. Before the 1500s, sure, prejudices existed, but they were mostly based on religion or tribal affiliation. The concept of race as a biological hierarchy was really invented during the era of European exploration and the transatlantic slave trade. And unfortunately, this pseudoscience eventually scaled up into massive, horrific systems of discrimination. By the 1890s, we saw Jim Crow laws enforcing brutal legal segregation in the U.S. By 1933, Nazi Germany was weaponizing racial pseudoscience to justify the Holocaust. And in 1948, South Africa built the oppressive apartheid legal structure. These massive, horrific systems weren't built by monsters. They were built by ordinary people who were actively rewarded by their societies for in-group loyalty and punished if they showed empathy to outsiders.
Which brings us to Section 4, 5 Stages of Bias.
How exactly does an ordinary mind go from experiencing simple insecurity to participating in something as massive as systemic discrimination? Psychologists actually map this out into 5 distinct stages, showing how racism functions as a defense mechanism. It starts off innocently enough. Stage 1 is just seeking group affiliation, looking for identity and belonging. But then, to strengthen that group identity, Stage 2 kicks in, developing enmity or hostility towards other groups. Stage 3 is where things take a dark turn, completely withdrawing empathy from outsiders. Next comes Stage 4, homogenization. This is where you stop seeing individuals altogether and only see a generalized, flat stereotype of the outgroup. And finally, Stage 5 is scapegoating. This is when individuals, usually those with strong narcissistic or paranoid traits, project their own personal flaws and psychological failings onto a marginalized group, basically to avoid taking any responsibility themselves.
Research also highlights some specific personality traits that are strongly linked to severe bias. For instance, individuals who score high in social dominance orientation, which basically means they prefer strict social rankings and actually see inequality as normal, are highly prone to prejudice. The same goes for folks with right-wing authoritarian tendencies. They typically crave strict order and deeply fear outsiders as a threat to their way of life. Now, you combine those traits with a lack of intergroup contact and throw in a belief in the just world phenomenon, which is the idea that people at the bottom of society naturally deserve what they get, and man, you have a potent recipe for severe, deeply entrenched bias.
Okay, let's look at some solutions in Section 5, how we unlearn bias. Now, here is absolutely the most empowering part of this explainer. Because racism is a learned habit built on mental shortcuts and not some inevitable biological destiny, it can absolutely be unlearned. The exact same research that explains why we become biased in the first place shows us the roadmap to dismantling it. Granted, we still have a huge mountain to climb. A 2025 Pew Research survey across dozens of countries found a median of 34% of adults globally still view racial or ethnic discrimination as a very big problem in their society. So the impacts are deeply felt around the world today, proving we definitely have vital work left to do. Yet backed by literally over 500 studies, science offers us a remarkably powerful tool. It's called the intergroup contact hypothesis. This heavily researched principle proves that simply having direct, cooperative contact with people from different groups fundamentally rewires the brain. When we actually sit down and work together toward a common goal, our anxiety naturally decreases, our empathy rises, and those deeply ingrained, non-conscious stereotypes, they completely lose their power over our behavior.
And the coolest part? We can actually see real progress happening right now. Thanks to shifting societal norms and much greater intergroup contact, data from Project Implicit recorded a massive 26% drop in anti-Black, pro-white implicit bias in the United States between 2007 and 2020. I mean, that is a staggering shift in deeply held cognitive associations in just 13 years. It absolutely proves that our minds are incredibly malleable.
So the big question is, how do we keep accelerating this positive trend? Well, we lean hard into evidence-based solutions. First off, we've got to facilitate more intergroup contact and collaboration in our daily lives. We can also utilize prejudice habit-breaking training. This is a real thing that actually teaches individuals how to catch and replace their biased thoughts right in the moment. And on a larger, macro level, we need to champion desegregation policies, push for diverse education, and work on building fair systemic institutions. Because by addressing both the individual mind and the broader architecture of society, we can actively dismantle the structures that feed prejudice.
Ultimately, racism isn't really about inherently bad people. It's about ordinary minds shaped by complicated histories, flawed systems, and deep-seated personal insecurities. But knowing that prejudice is a learned habit and not your biological destiny leaves us with one incredibly vital question. Knowing what you know now about how your brain works, what will you do today to challenge, recognize, and rewrite your own mind's shortcuts?